Tonight, we continue our journey through the history of Britain. In the last chapter, we explored the rise of Anglo-Saxon England and the small kingdoms that formed after the Romans left. Now we move into a new and changing time, a time when longships appeared on the horizon and new arrivals came from across the sea. This is the story of the Vikings in Britain, a calm journey through history, designed to help you relax and unwind. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly begin. By the late 8th century, Britain had become a land of kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons had settled across much of the island. Small territories had grown into larger and more organized powers. Kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia shaped the political landscape. Life across these kingdoms followed a steady rhythm. Villages spread across the countryside. Farmers worked the land, growing crops and raising animals. Craftsmen practiced their trades, and communities remained closely connected to the land around them. At the center of each kingdom stood a king. These rulers depended on loyal warriors, men who protected the kingdom and supported their leader. In return, they were rewarded with land, wealth, and status. Power was not fixed. It shifted between kingdoms over time. At different moments, one kingdom might rise above the others, only to lose influence later. Despite these changes, there was a sense of structure across the land. Trade routes connected regions. Churches and monasteries played an important role in daily life. Christianity had spread widely, shaping beliefs, traditions, and learning. Monasteries became centers of knowledge. Monks carefully copied manuscripts, preserving history, religion, and stories. These quiet places were often located near the coast or along rivers. They were peaceful, but also vulnerable. Unlike fortified towns, many monasteries had little protection. They were not built to defend against attack. Instead, they were open places of worship and learning. Across the sea, beyond the shores of Britain, other lands were also changing. In regions now known as Scandinavia, communities were developing along rugged coastlines and fjords. The people who lived there would later become known as the Vikings. Life in these northern lands could be harsh. Winters were long and cold. Farming land was limited. Communities often relied on the sea. They became skilled sailors and shipbuilders. Over time, they began to travel further from their homelands. At first, these journeys may have been for trade. But as their knowledge of the sea grew, so did their ambition. They built long, narrow ships designed for speed and flexibility. These ships could travel across open seas, but also navigate rivers and shallow waters. This allowed them to reach places that others could not. Britain, with its long coastline and scattered settlements, became an ideal destination. Its monasteries held valuable items, gold, silver, and religious artifacts. Its towns and villages were often unprotected. From a distance, Britain may have appeared as a land rich with opportunity. At first, there were only small signs of what was to come. Unfamiliar ships on the horizon, strangers arriving along the coast. But these early moments would soon lead to something much larger. The world of Anglo-Saxon England, which had developed over generations, was about to face a new and unexpected challenge. From the sea, longships would arrive, and with them, a new chapter in the history of Britain would begin. In the year 793 AD, a moment occurred that would later be remembered as the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. On a small island off the northeast coast of England stood a monastery called Lindisfarne. It was a peaceful place. Monks lived there quietly, spending their days in prayer, study, and writing. The monastery was known for its learning and religious importance. It was not built for defense. There were no strong walls, no soldiers guarding its shores. Then, one day, Ships appeared on the horizon, long, narrow vessels, moving quickly across the water. The people aboard these ships were unfamiliar. They came from across the sea, from the lands of Scandinavia. These were the Vikings. When they arrived at Lindisfarne, the monastery was unprepared. The attack was sudden. The Vikings entered the settlement, taking what they could. Valuable items such as gold, silver, and religious artifacts were seized. Buildings were damaged. The quiet life of the monastery was interrupted in a way that had never been experienced before. For the people of Britain, this event was shocking. It was not just the attack itself, but the nature of it. The Vikings had come from the sea, quickly and without warning. They struck a place that was not protected, and then disappeared just as quickly. News of the raid spread across the land. For many, it felt like the beginning of something new and uncertain. At first, these raids were not constant. They were occasional, small groups arriving along the coast, targeting settlements that were easy to reach and lightly defended. Monasteries were often chosen. They held valuable items and were usually isolated. But over time, the raids became more frequent. More ships began to appear. More coastal areas were affected. Communities living near the sea became increasingly aware of the danger. The Vikings had several advantages. Their ships were fast and flexible. They could land almost anywhere along the coast. They could travel up rivers, reaching inland settlements. This made them difficult to defend against. By the time news of a raid reached a nearby town, the Vikings were often already gone. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not prepared for this type of threat. Their systems of defense were designed for land-based conflict, not sudden attacks from the sea. There were no permanent coastal defenses, no early warning systems. Each raid exposed this weakness. For the Vikings, these journeys were part of a larger pattern. They were not only visiting Britain, they traveled to many parts of Europe, raiding, trading, and exploring. Their knowledge of the sea allowed them to move between regions with ease. Over time, these raids began to change the way people in Britain lived. Coastal communities became more cautious. Some settlements moved further inland. Others began to consider how they might defend themselves. Kings and leaders started to recognize that this was not a temporary problem. The Vikings were returning again and again, and each time they became more familiar with the land, more aware of its wealth and its vulnerabilities. The raid on Lindisfarne would later be remembered as a symbolic beginning, a moment that marked the start of a new era. But at the time, it was simply one event among many that would follow. The quiet world of Anglo-Saxon England, built over generations, was beginning to change. The presence of the Vikings was growing, and what had begun as small, sudden raids would soon develop into something much larger. A shift from brief attacks to lasting settlements across the land. As Viking settlers established themselves across parts of Britain, life began to settle into a steady and familiar rhythm. Although the Vikings are often remembered for raids and battles, most of their time was spent living ordinary lives. They became farmers, craftsmen, traders, and members of growing communities. In the areas of the Danelaw, villages and farms spread across the countryside. Homes were built from wood, with thatched roofs made from straw or reeds. These houses were long and narrow, often referred to as longhouses. Inside, a central fire provided warmth and a place for cooking. Smoke rose slowly toward the roof, escaping through small openings. The interior would have been warm, but often dim, with light coming mainly from the fire. Families lived together in these shared spaces. Daily life revolved around farming. Fields were worked using simple tools. Crops such as barley, wheat, and oats were grown. Vegetables were also cultivated. Animals played an important role. Cattle were kept for milk and labor. Sheep provided wool. Pigs were raised for meat. Fishing was also common, especially in coastal areas and near rivers. The sea remained an important part of Viking life. It provided food and a means of travel and trade. The Vikings were skilled shipbuilders. Their longships allowed them to move quickly across water. These ships were not only used for raiding, but also for transport and trade. Craftsmanship was highly valued. Blacksmiths created tools, weapons, and household items from iron. Carpenters built homes, ships, and everyday objects. Weavers produced clothing from wool. Clothing was practical and designed for warmth. Men often wore tunics and trousers. Women wore long dresses, sometimes with layered garments. Cloaks were commonly worn to protect against the cold. Jewelry was also important. Brooches, rings, and necklaces were worn as decoration, and sometimes as symbols of status. Life in Viking communities was structured but simple. Families worked together. Children learned skills from a young age, helping with farming, crafts, and daily tasks. Storytelling remained an important part of culture. Stories of gods, heroes, and journeys were shared around fires. These stories were passed down through generations. Religion in early Viking society was based on Norse beliefs. They worshipped gods such as Odin, associated with wisdom and war, and Thor, linked to thunder and strength. These beliefs were closely connected to nature and the forces of the world. Over time, as Vikings settled in Britain, some began to adopt Christianity. This process was gradual. For a time, both belief systems existed side by side. Communities adapted, blending old traditions with new influences. Trade was an important part of daily life. Viking settlements were connected to wider networks across Europe. Goods such as metals, furs, and crafted items were exchanged. Markets became places where people gathered to trade and interact. Despite the earlier conflicts, life in many Viking-controlled areas became stable. Communities grew. Fields were worked. Families lived their lives in a steady rhythm. The image of constant warfare does not reflect the full reality. For most people, daily life was about survival, work, and community. Yet even as this stability developed, tension remained. Some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued to resist Viking control. And in the south, one kingdom in particular was preparing to challenge Viking dominance. The balance of power in Britain was beginning to shift once again. And soon, this would lead to a series of events that would shape the future of the island. As Viking settlements spread across much of England, not all kingdoms accepted their presence. In the south, the kingdom of Wessex remained independent. It became the center of resistance against Viking expansion. At the heart of this resistance was a king who would later become one of the most well-known figures in early English history. His name was Alfred. Alfred became king of Wessex in the year 871 AD. At the time, the situation was uncertain. Viking forces had already taken control of large parts of England. Kingdoms such as Northumbria and East Anglia had fallen under Viking influence. Wessex stood as one of the last major kingdoms resisting them. In the early years of Alfred's reign, conflict was constant. Battles were fought across the land. Viking armies moved quickly, challenging the defenses of Wessex. At times, Alfred's position seemed fragile. There were moments when defeat appeared close. One of the most difficult periods came when Viking forces gained the upper hand. Alfred was forced to retreat. For a time, he withdrew to a marshy area known as Athelney, in what is now Somerset. From this remote and quiet place, he regrouped. He gathered support, and slowly, he prepared to fight back. Alfred's approach to leadership was careful and strategic. Rather than relying only on open battles, he worked to strengthen the foundations of his kingdom. He reorganized his army. He ensured that forces were ready to respond quickly when needed. He also began building a network of fortified settlements known as burhs. These burhs were designed to protect towns and communities. They were placed at key locations across Wessex. Each one could provide shelter and defense in times of attack. This system made it harder for Viking forces to move freely across the land. It also gave the people of Wessex greater security. In addition to strengthening defenses, Alfred recognized the importance of knowledge and organization. He encouraged learning. He supported the use of written records. And he worked to improve communication across his kingdom. These changes helped create a more stable and organized society. Eventually, Alfred was able to confront the Viking forces again. One of the most important moments came at the Battle of Edington. Here, Alfred's army faced a Viking force led by Guthrum, a Viking leader. The battle was a turning point. Alfred's forces were able to achieve victory. Following this, an agreement was made between Alfred and Guthrum. Guthrum agreed to withdraw from Wessex and accept certain conditions. He even converted to Christianity, marking a symbolic shift. This agreement helped establish clearer boundaries between Viking-controlled areas and Anglo-Saxon territory. It brought a period of relative stability. Alfred's success did not end Viking presence in England, but it did change the balance of power. Wessex remained independent, and it became the foundation for future efforts to unify parts of England. Because of his leadership, Alfred became known as Alfred the Great. He is the only English king to be given this title. His reign marked an important moment in the history of Britain, not only for his military efforts, but for the systems he put in place. The defenses, organization, and focus on learning helped shape the future development of England. For the people living during this time, these events would have brought a sense of change. The constant threat of invasion began to ease in some areas. Communities could begin to rebuild and stabilize. Yet the presence of the Vikings remained. They were now part of the story of Britain. And while conflict had defined much of this period, it would not last forever. In time, the influence of Viking power would begin to decline. And the next chapter in this story would bring a gradual shift toward a more unified England. After years of conflict, settlement, and change, the influence of the Vikings in England began to shift. They were no longer only raiders. They had become settlers, rulers, and part of everyday life across large parts of the land. But over time, their dominance would begin to fade. Following the reign of Alfred the Great, the Kingdom of Wessex continued to grow in strength. Alfred's successors built upon the foundations he had created. They maintained the system of fortified towns, the burhs, which provided protection and stability. They strengthened the army, and they worked to reclaim land that had come under Viking control. One of Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder, continued this effort. He expanded the territory of Wessex and brought more regions under his influence. His sister, Athelflaed, also played an important role. She ruled the Kingdom of Mercia and led successful campaigns against Viking-held areas. Together, they helped push back the boundaries of the Danelaw. Over time, more land was brought under Anglo-Saxon control. The process was gradual. There were still battles, still moments of resistance, but the balance of power was beginning to change. The Viking-controlled regions did not disappear overnight. Many Viking communities remained in place. People continued to live, farm, and trade across the land. In fact, the blending of cultures continued. Anglo-Saxon and Viking traditions had become closely connected. Language, customs, and ways of life had influenced one another. Even as political control shifted, the cultural impact of the Vikings remained. Eventually, a king named Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, would achieve something that had not been seen before. In the early 10th century, he became the first ruler to control most of what we now recognize as England. This marked a significant moment. For the first time, much of the island was united under one king. The long period of separate kingdoms and competing powers was beginning to come to an end. The Viking Age in England did not end with a single event. There was no clear moment when it stopped. Instead, it faded gradually. Raids became less frequent. Settlements became part of the established landscape, and the idea of a unified kingdom grew stronger. Yet the legacy of the Vikings did not disappear. Their influence remained in many parts of England, in place names, language, and cultural traditions. Words from Old Norse became part of everyday English. Place names ending in by and Thorpe still mark areas of Viking settlement. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal details of their lives. Tools, jewelry, and remains of settlements offer quiet insights into a time that shaped the island. For the people living through this period, change would have felt gradual. Life continued. Fields were worked. Families grew. Communities adapted. The story of the Vikings in Britain is not only one of raids and battles. It is also a story of settlement, adaptation, and lasting influence. And as this chapter came to a close, a new phase in the history of England was beginning. A phase shaped by the kingdoms that had grown stronger and the foundations that had been laid over generations. The land had changed once again, and the echoes of this time would continue to shape Britain for centuries to come. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of Britain's story. From the first Viking ships appearing on the horizon, to the raids, settlements, and the creation of the Danelaw, the Vikings left a lasting mark on the land. Over time, their influence blended with Anglo-Saxon life, shaping language, culture, and the future of England. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how England continued to develop and how these early kingdoms slowly moved toward unity. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can subscribe for more long, relaxing journeys through the past. For now, thank you for listening, and have a peaceful night.